I'm now going to invite the panel, our first panel, to the stage. So perhaps if they could head up. Were you asking Diego that we'd get something spicy to start us off today? We're also running a little over time, so we might have this panel conversation and then we might have lunch at that point, but we'll just take that as it comes. So as they're making their way onto the stage and sitting down, I'll move. That's I'll move. I'll introduce them. Wait, where am I going to go? Maybe, yeah. Well, I'm going to leave, but I'm just going to introduce you while I'm here. So Leen Reith is an artist based in Sydney who makes work about and draws parallels between trans experience, institutional narratives, and arts organising. So they're showing 6 video works in Unison. Here comes Leen, made over the last 4 years under the title Counter-Institutional Narratives. Take a seat here, I'll move in a second. So you can see the images of the show behind us. Indra Liusuari is an artist whose banner work hangs at the entry point to Unison, which is titled, "Did you know that there are art galleries in Collingwood Yards?" Another spicy comment. This text-based work ironically observes the relatively predictable typologies of cultural expression in urban cultural centres. And Salote Tawale, who I must say that Leen and Salote have both come over from Sydney, so we're really lucky to have them here. This is the Sydney couch here. Salote's practice addresses ideas around self-representation, humorously challenges stereotypes, and presents nuanced articulations of the complex negotiations around identity as a Fijian woman living in Australia. And Salote's work is also in Unison, and it's a representation of a large-scale work from her 2014 West Space exhibition, Colonising West Space, and it's right there. And Lisa Radford is also on this panel, who's an artist who writes and teaches. Lisa also presented a major exhibition across in 2016 across all of the spaces in West Space's Burke Street space. So now I'm going to get off of this couch and hand over to our panel chair, West Space curator and also Unison curator, Sebastian Henry Jones. So thank you.
Shall we get comfy?
Thanks, Joanna. Hi, everyone. I'm Seb. I'm just going to get into the panel. But before I begin, I'm just going to do a bit of work to kind of contextualize what this panel is talking about. So yeah, we're going to talk about the gradual professionalisation of the small to medium artist-run sector, making connections between the corporate logic of universities today and the fact that almost exclusively those who show and work in artist-run initiatives have been through an undergraduate and in many cases postgraduate degree. So in 2020, the organisation moved to Collingwood Yards, an arts precinct that embodies the enormous changes occurring throughout inner city suburbs in Melbourne. As complementary homogenising forces, what kinds of conditions do areas under intense gentrification and the professionalisation of the artist-run spaces within them create for the production of art and culture? What are the experiences of emerging artists in these environments, and how are these influences anticipated and reproduced within spaces of higher education? And lastly, before we begin, I'd like to ground this discussion by saying that we're on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country. Fitzroy Collingwood was a meeting place for Aboriginal people long before European settlement. Throughout the 20th century, this area has been home to large numbers of Aboriginal and First Nations people. As we heard from Uncle Ringo, the displacement and dispersal of Aboriginal people from metropolitan centres across this continent demonstrates the ongoing presence of colonisation today. And as such, any conversation about the gentrification of this area must be framed through this narrative. So, before I ask the first question, I might just ask each of the panellists with me to briefly introduce themselves. I might begin with you, Salote.
Thanks, Seb. Ooh, hang on. I like the sound of this, though. I feel like I do a bit of karaoke or something a bit later if anyone's into it. My name's Salote Tawale. I grew up here in Melbourne. I was born in Fiji. So I went to art school here and did my master's at RMIT. And I actually just really enjoyed my time becoming, as a rookie artist and developing my practice, and then moved to Sydney about 10 years ago. I just felt like maybe I needed to practice somewhere else and also experience living in another city. And that's been really awesome for me, I should say. And as for my relationship to kind of like the history of Westbase, I remember when I started at RMIT having a discussion about what an ARI was. Did we call it ARIs back then? AR something else. It wasn't an initiative, it was something else. Anyhow, at that time, our lecturers were telling us about Westbase when it started in the actual West, but I started at RMIT around 2002, so I think you're in Anthony Street, is that right? Anthony, so like international now, in Anthony Street. And so I think it was like a bit of a smaller space. I don't know if you remember that space, Lisa. Yeah. And even back then, actually, I think there was this discussion about the professionalisation of Westbase, because I think there's that moment of that step over from being an fully artist-run initiative to then I guess in a positive note, I could say providing a professional development space for people who are not artists but still work within the arts, or the mix-up of that. Sorry, don't want to say there's a binary there. Yeah, that's me.
Thanks for that, Salote. Leen?
Yeah, my relationship with universities, I guess I studied art first in Brisbane at Queensland College of Art and did my honours year there. But after that, I realised I needed some other qualification to have a steady job. So I became a librarian as well and ended up working in a professional capacity at VCA in the library there for a little while before moving to Sydney, where I decided to do my PhD. And that was 6.5 years ago, and I just submitted my PhD last month. It's about trans experience, institutional life, and community organising. I'm currently not a member of an ARI, but I've been a member of ARIs in Brisbane, Melbourne, and in Sydney, and most recently with Front Yard, but I'm not with them anymore. But yeah, so I've got a bit of experience with different ARIs. I guess I'm most interested in ARIs, like in terms of when I think about the broader picture of the art community as a whole, because they're these spaces where artists, where art community and the concept of community and institutional kind of concepts and structures intersect. Artists are kind of making a choice when they either start an artist-run initiative or become a part of one that already exists. And I guess that choice is, how do I want to spend my time? Because usually it's a voluntary role or underpaid role. So I guess my interest is so if we're going to do this and give our free time or be underpaid for our time, what are we going to be doing? And to me, that's kind of the most interesting question. What are we investing in, I guess? Yeah.
Thanks, Leen. Might go to Lisa and then Indra.
Hi, nice to meet you too. But good to see you again, Salote. I have this. I'm echoing.
You're in a bigger space than the rest of us.
Or I'm in a void. Interesting, it's funny that you said Anthony Street. I guess my first Westbase experience, if we're going to do that, was when I was at TAFE. I was taught by John Campbell, and it was in the Footscray Mall space, and it was a Troy Emery show. I vividly remember it. And in terms of that, because it's such a crossover, all of that in institution, education, and artist-run space. So I guess I went to Footscray TAFE, that later became VUT, and then I went to VCA. And at VCA, I met a crew of kids, because I still call the students kids, because I teach there now. So
And you're older.
Sorry?
And you're older.
When
so
we
they
worked at
seem like
KFC, I
kids.
call people kids, and I was like 1 year younger than me, so it's just everyone's a kid. The kids are all right? Anyway, and met like Blair Trothowan, Sharon Goodwin, Amanda Marburg. I've known Amanda for a long time, and they were starting a space called TCB Art Inc., and it took over from an old space called Grey Area, which was run by people like Michael Graves from RMIT. They all had studios above the Port Phillip Arcade, which now doesn't exist because there's going to be an underground station. And they started a gallery there. I joined in my last year of towards the last end, third year of VCA. The rent was $50 a week. And they were there for 5 years or something, I think, until gentrification meant we had to move, and we ended up in Chinatown. And then we were the support network for one of the first commercial galleries that was to be started by I'm going to say the skater kids, so Jared Rawlins, who's now the curator at Mona, and Blair Trothowan. And TCB acted as the parasite support network. So at that time there was no funding for rent for artists, so it worked in a very different model. And it was, how do you run a space? It was a political engagement. There was no board. It was a group of people. It was a collective. No one got paid. Artists had to pay for shows, which was cheap at the time. And you would apply for funding for rent, but the funding councils wouldn't give you money for rent. So it took a long time before we got any money to support those spaces. Anyway, so I worked with TCB for probably 12 years. When I left, I also asked for it to be no, I didn't say that, but eventually I was it's okay for things to die, things should die, and be renewed. But yeah, I worked sessionally as a sessional slut, as I like to say, across lots of the universities and in TAFE and in high schools in order to earn a buck to be an artist and the writer that I do writing. And I still work at the VCA, and I'm on the board of NAVA now. So there's kind of these varying roles of responsibility and conversations, I think, that I've been a part of. Anyway, that's me.
Yeah, and right? I saw recently you're still showing in REs from time to time.
I had a show at TCB.
Yeah, it's really cool.
With Fu, who was my master's student, who was a New Zealand painter who I met when he came to VCA and asked to work with me. And we laughed for 2 years and talked about Adele for 2 years during a pandemic. So we did a show together.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Indra, would you just like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Indra. I just completed my honours in fine arts last year, but my main study is in architecture because that's where the money is.
Apparently.
Yeah, apparently. I'm ready to be exploited just for the money at this point. But yeah, my experience with ARIs, I'm pretty new to the arts industry and all that. Mind you, I do not remember what happened in 2001. I only remember what happened in 2007 with Britney Spears' meltdown. So that was my 9/11 moment. Yeah, all I know about ARIs is that in my experience as a young artist and also recent graduates, it's very highly regarded these days, and it's I don't know, a platform to emerge, but also very competitive platform to emerge from. Yeah, I don't know, people really worship Westspace in school, and I was why is that? And I realized how big it is until I kind of visited itself and researched more. But I was oh wow, Diego said, it is old. Yeah, I don't know, smart people just showing in Westspace, I guess. Not me though.
Yeah, when we did our recent call out for the 2 commission series for the second half of next year, we had 150 something applications for 2 spots. And that's a common story for artist-run initiatives across the continent who do an open call, as many of you would know. But yeah, I'll just start by asking the first question. So over 5 locations, Westspace has slowly moved from the western suburbs of Melbourne, Footscray, east to the inner north of Melbourne via the CBD. These movements are responses both to rising rent prices under gentrification as well as embodying the growth of the organisation and its aspirations. As rent prices increase, artist-run initiatives respond by competing for funding, developing philanthropic relationships, and formalising working relationships, which inherently change the way they work. I'm wondering if each of you have any thoughts about the ways that artist-run initiatives have changed over the last couple of decades, as the cities themselves that they're in are also rapidly transforming. I might go to you first, Indra.
Sure. I thought that, well, like I said, I'm pretty, I only know about ARIs like from 2021, because before that I wasn't really practicing in arts and all that. So what I'm kind of exposed to was that there's like non-commercial establishments that kind of exist in this like intellectual, artistic, and cultural bubble. Like ARIs have this like cool DIY experimental essence that definitely kind of attract a specific set of crowd, and kind of also cults a different set of crowd. Like my fiance, who's a non-creative worker who works as a crew, cabin crew, never really heard of Westspace until Unison, but obviously knows like institutions like NGV and Acme and ACCA kind of thing. But if you ask someone in like Berlin cosplay down the road and drinking non-GMO organic soy or latte down on Gertrude, they have a good chance knowing it. And reflecting back to how I feel ARIs exist in the bubble kind of make me reflect how I discovered ARIs as well. Like recalling what Diego mentioned about homogenization also in the introduction paragraph. I found out about ARIs only after through assimilating myself to like the inner cities, like underground, cool, gritty subculture. Like I was still wearing skinny jeans and hair in a clean cut side part up to 2021, and I knew no one from the art scene, nor anyone from the art scene or like art industry kind of wants to make contact with me, except for like vanity galleries who were like, hey, yeah, you can show us for $4,000.
Yeah.
I was like, no. But yeah, I guess that's my observation with ARIs.
Yeah, and assimilation's a key word that you've highlighted in the banner work that you've made for the exhibition across the courtyard. Lisa, do you have any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I've got probably too many. The assimilation thing is really interesting, and I guess I always think about the gentrification thing tied to, well, it's obviously tied to economics and politics. And I guess I'm going to use an analogy maybe, or like a comparison rather than to speak specifically about here, but like two things come to mind. Like in the UK, where incorporating artist-run spaces or art galleries into planning and development became a really important, like they fill empty buildings with artists, they gentrify the area and they move them on. I would say that might or may not happen here. And then on the flip side, thinking about Paris, so like why the artist-run culture in Melbourne, I guess, has been so strong is because we have the urbanisation of it has occurred at a different rate. Like, for example, Paul Keating, I was going to say, that's weird. Jeff Kennett made a 2020 plan or 2010 plan, or I can't remember. It's got another number at the end of it. It's 20-something, to get people back living in the city. And that's when there was a move, because before the 90s, yeah, Melbourne 2000, that's what it would have been, 3000 or something like that. I don't know. And so that was to get people living back in the city.
Is that when we got Victoria on the move?
I think we were on the... Oh, yeah, Jeff Kennett put us on the move, yeah. He closed all the tech schools. He did lots of, like, fun things. Anyway, but in Paris, for example, because it's already urbanised and highly populated, dense population, that they provide subsidised living and studios for artists, which I find interesting, and I guess I only know about that because... like one of John and I's colleagues and one of my ex-lecturers, Jeff Lowe, lives in Paris. So you learn about these other ways of facilitating artists living in high density and now expensive suburbs. or
London
cities.
also has that as well.
Yeah, right. So that's interesting. In Melbourne, I feel like we have developers encouraged to build buildings, but they have to have a creative space at the creative component, and what that means is really up for grabs. It could be a t-shirt shop, right? Whereas if it was something more, so it's between governance and anarchy is where I'm like interested in, right? So if you could ensure that was like a community of artists that could afford to live in the city, a little bit like pulling down like commission towers and then making people live out in the suburbs is not necessarily a great way to like. Anyway, so they're the kind of things that I was thinking about. One, so that's like a big infrastructural change, I guess, like big government change, but then also like as an example of something that happened during TCB's time. So when we first do get funding, it's like, okay, so what do we do with this funding? There's a responsibility that comes with this money. We don't have a governance structure. We're run as I say gang, but clearly some people did more stuff than other stuff depending on what their roles and what they had to do outside, like jobs, art, writing, etc. And I remember having a very big discussion with the people on the board at the time. Do we want to pay someone, or do we want all that money to go back to artists? I mean, it wasn't a lot of money. It's $12,000. Because the rent we had at Chinatown was amazing, which, as I said to Amy earlier, was actually the home of the communist headquarters. So the history of the building was really amazing. And there was like a Chinese gambling house in there, which is like a good thanks, Jeff Sparrow, for writing that book. Anyway, but there was a very serious conversation, knowing that as soon as you paid one person, you created a hierarchy within the board, and that we were really focused on art and artists. That was a decision that we made. So we figured out how to have all that money go to the artists, pay for the rent, give them a fee, and negotiate sitting the gallery as part of the contract with the artists and ourselves. So that was the responsibility that we took for running the space. Also hyper aware of that professionalisation, that there was some kind of weird professionalised, English, I'm not going to be able to say it, professionalisation going on that we didn't necessarily understand but were conscious of, and also funding criteria shifting. So what did that mean? Like, what does education mean for an artist-run space when we really just want to show art? Like, we want to support young artists or our peers and show art. And what does it mean for a mentoring and all those things? Like, we were making political decisions to refuse to use those words or that terminology and try to reframe it. Not saying it's a political decision, but like having a collective discussion felt very political at the time. Anyway, is that okay?
Yeah, that was perfect, and like an amazing history lesson as well. Like, one thing about talking about artist-run initiatives in the recent history is like you get this like really amazing, like rich urban narrative that emerges.
Yeah, well, it is kind of amazing, like, and especially the way that folds in with things like the music scene, or like there's all these beautiful overlays that. In some ways, it's good that it's not documented, and in other ways, because it has to exist in this, with oral culture as the theme, it has to exist in this oral where there's a kind of empowerment to that. But yeah,
I'm interested in what you say, like when you say scene, like we say music scene and art scene was said by Indra before, and in actual fact, like the RE scene, although having a huge connection to universities and to bigger institutions, and there is certainly pathways there. There are actually a lot of art scenes. There are a whole lot of artists who buy houses that will never show in either of those, that belong to commercial galleries. Or, the first gallery I showed in was like the Mount Waverley Community House back when I was, in high school or something. And so it's like, because I guess we're existing in this scene, we're going, oh, the art scene. But, however, like, I met someone the other day I went to high school with who's a painter and shows regional painter. And so there's all these, like, interconnections to me. So I feel like, in a way, we, as artists, can exist across a few of those, I think, if we're lucky, but this is like one small, sorry to say that, like section of what is a greater thing, and those, what about all those artists that exist across music scenes and art scenes and that kind of thing, you know? So in a way, is, or even if I look at West Space, is it's inevitable that things are going to change, and they change, I guess, in relation to what we were saying, these kind of outside, inside factors, but also the people who participate in them, what they see as pathways or movements towards other things.
I was thinking something similar. A particular example from Brisbane was a redevelopment in West End where there was, in terms of like art scenes, there was a old building filled with artist studios, and most of them were not institutionally trained. They just had their practices there and their own careers in the way that they wanted to have them. And then when the area became gentrified, those artists lost their studios, and there was just like a process of applying to the local council for some kind of art space. Could have been performance or exhibition, or I think as some circusing places applied, like all different kinds of arts. But the place that won the bid was an ARI run by institutionally trained artists. So there are different art scenes. There's these institutionally trained ARI scenes, and that was like an indication of gentrification. Like there were artists there before, but they brought in a different kind of art scene to gentrify the place. And I think they had a 2-year lease and then they moved on to somewhere else, and it's probably apartments now.
I guess you do learn to write a proposal in art school in the language
I used to refuse to teach that.
I couldn't at the time. I was like, I've never got anything.
Well, I think that's a good moment to switch to the next question, which is about this connection between universities and artist-run initiatives. So to lay the groundwork, in cities where the cost of running an art space is rising, professional ways of working are an effective means of survival, requiring high skills in administration and written expression. At the same time, competition for exhibition opportunities is fierce for fine arts graduates. Almost exclusively, the people showing and working in artist-run initiatives have been through some kind of tertiary education degree. As such, how has the idea of a fine arts education changed over the last few decades? Is it commensurate with broader changes in the sector? What ways are young artists learning about making art on the one hand and entering a competitive arts industry on the other, in that kind of journey from university to showing in artist-run spaces?
I feel like, because I teach at the University of Sydney, luckily got a position there at the beginning of COVID, at the very beginning of semester 1, so I didn't even have to teach. I was like, I'm being paid to pretty much read a bunch of manuals and do some appropriate teaching resource online content things. Anyhow, I feel like, because I teach first year foundation as one of my classes, and I feel like a huge responsibility to, from the get-go, try to help students develop their processes, but also start to think lightly around the edges about that, if the professionalisation of their creative, because I think most people think, I still think this happens, right? Students come in and like, I'm just going to paint pictures of violins and like work in my home studio and see gigs in the evening or something. I don't know. Clearly out of touch of what the kids are doing today. But because and also at the same time of talking about that with them, it's like there is no one pathway, because their parents are also coming up and going like, what's going to happen? And you have to be like, oh, I don't know. And then all the other teachers that I teach with, like everyone's had a different kind of pathway within the arts. So I cannot tell you. And within university, the thing that I did at RMIT, because I think First Sight Gallery is still running, right? Yeah. I just with my fellow students, we were like showing a few times a year, either at First Sight or like taking on whatever opportunities, is to get them into that mode. But also I feel like sometimes that like they don't have to take that pathway, but just like maybe I'm one of those instigators of students getting out of uni and going straight to an ARI for their first show.
Yeah, for me, there's something about like some kind of education in a creative field that, like should lend itself to some sense of creativity. But I guess like we're seeing in universities increasingly like the kind of education you experience across the board in a university now is like very much attached to a vocation. So you're not necessarily learning about the world as something that you have the ability to impact upon. You're like learning about the world and the skills that you need to be able to fit into like prescribed like worker, very modular kind of thing.
Yeah, I do think so, but I also think it's like trying to say, like, I think you're right. I just think also at the same time you're trying to say, no, you don't have to do that. It's like build this thing but break it as well, but I don't know if that works.
I don't follow.
Like with students in the way that you talk about pathways and whatever, like. If that, is that fit in?
Well, I don't know whether, like, is it okay? Because I'm going out of order. I mean, I guess I'd maybe to kind of back it up or something. I wrote down that are universities changing the way artists behave, or actually, because actually, in actual fact, the university is always a little bit behind, right? Like it is not the forefront. It is like playing catch up. I would say I have taught in one for too long, probably, but and that so that it is this kind of network of things impacting on behavior. So it's like I wrote behave and I was like, fuck, that's kind of a terrifying word in some ways. And so where I work at the VCA, you have a history of an institution trying to resist the university, like remain an art school within a university that got taken over. So John Campbell was a very big part of also like Save the VCA, which was a campaign.
I think I would make the comment that all art schools within university keep trying to save themselves.
Yeah, but they've either begun inside a university or they've begun outside. And the VCA was unique in that it was started outside of the university. It was an art school. Maybe run badly or whatever, or like fiscally, not badly in terms of like the content, but maybe it financially didn't survive or something, and thus. So we act as like cultural cred for the University of Melbourne as one way of thinking about it. I keep arguing that they need to start thinking about the VCA like Berlin, like we run at a loss. The rest of the country, which is the University of Melbourne, can run at a profit. But we run at a loss because the profit comes later with art. Like it's not a business year profit.
Also, aren't they just making a huge profit off business subjects? 300 students
no,
per
off
class
their property
in
portfolio, I'm pretty sure.
Portfolio
but anyway.
and international students.
But like, so for example, like teaching at the moment, we don't have a module system. It's still a studio-based system. Like you get first years coming in, they're younger than they were in the past. Like it was in like 15, 20 years ago, it was mature age students after they'd gone to TAFE or that's the type of student we were taking. As the education system was dismantled by consecutive governments, so that you have the demise of TAFE and you have like a VCE subjects that demand there's a lot of writing preferenced over the visual, you have everything's changing at once. Like everything's changing all the time, obviously, but like at once. And what you see is like a bunch of students coming in thinking that they want to paint violins, but also knowing that there is a whole world out there where they, like the Instagram or the internet can tell them that there is a lifestyle and money to be made as a contemporary artist. Like, what is this thing, contemporary artist? So you had first year students starting to ask questions like, teach me how to write a grant. And I very vividly remember after taking over, like John and I taught. So John taught me, and then we taught together. It's lucky that you're here because you get to be like a compass point for both Diego and I, it seems. But anyway, and then I take over this class which was called professional practice, and I deliberately renamed unprofessional practice because I wanted to emphasize to the students that, well, and maybe to myself, that it was about making art. Before, you can't write a grant until you know how to make something or have language around that thing that you're making.
Is that true anymore, though?
What do you mean?
I feel like you can write a proposal for artwork that you've never tried to make. And
No, not try to make one artwork, but have a language of what your work is like. And if you don't have that, which feels like should be incubated, like this is the beauty of the art school in my dream, of my dreams, is that it incubates and can go for as long as it needs to, because there's no retirement date as an artist. Like we, as Nava, we're fine. These are the tensions of when you're fighting for things like pay, but then you also want to have a secret and microeconomy. Do you know what I mean? Like these are all that, which is the, how do you teach someone to rebel, but also how do you teach them to survive, right? Like what that, and I think that's what Salote was trying to describe, like that tension between I'm still the punk, but I work for the university kind of vibe, which is really hard. And I guess, I've written it down as an answer to the next question, but during the pandemic, which is when I went from being in a studio to teaching online only, and I ran in third year I called it professional practice, it was fine. But for like many of the undergrads, I vividly remember getting Jared to come and speak about the history of Uplands, the commercial gallery. And the following year you have Savage Garden, Hyacinth, and what's that other one called? Asbestos, yep, open. And they're the kids opening spaces in their backyards going, how I want this on my terms. I don't know where I fit in the official sector. I don't know if I want to fit there. What happens if I do it myself?
I think there's I'm just remembering the last question and the question about progression and ARIs. Like I was just thinking about how, because it was a similar thing, or probably still is a similar thing in Brisbane with lots of DIY spaces. But in terms of like the progression of ARIs, there seems to be something that happens where those spaces are good for now at the start, but then the progression is that, and then you get a proper gallery space, and then you leave those spaces and get a job at a bigger institution. Yeah. Like that's the progression. But I think, we need, like, the way that professional practice is kind of taught at universities is this process of, okay, so you follow these steps and then you graduate, and if you're not kind of swept up by institutional approval and survive being an artist that way, then you become a teacher and you teach art, and then you teach students, and then they do the same thing. It becomes this, like, you're teaching people how to be you, and then it turns into this kind of like university cycle of like ins and outs that you might actually not get out of unless you're actively doing this like double life thing that you're describing, where yes, I'm part of the system and also I'm doing this other thing as well.
How do you sustain both in terms of energy? Exactly. I mean, I was even like, I don't know if I can do today. I'm tired, no offense. Diego said you have to. I'm glad that Katie's laughing. And I don't have to. And I thought about, because I do think too much and I get worried because I don't know what I want there to be an answer, and I know there's not one.
Yeah, I think the other, maybe part of the answer is I don't know, I did this really great project a couple of years ago that was specifically about like how do artists collectivize, and we kind of realized as a group that university doesn't teach you how to have like really meaningful collaborations. You might have to do an assignment like in undergrad that where you collaborate and everyone's like, oh fuck this, but okay, we have to do it. Yeah, there isn't necessarily, like, I haven't experienced it or observed it from other artists where we're actually taught to know what it feels like to have meaningful collaboration and do kind of meaningful organizing work. Like there's a real lack of that. And I don't know, that doesn't really answer the question of how you do both, but...
I run extracurricular, like, yeah. I mean, John Campbell and myself and Jeff Lowe, because I come from this history, right, of the extracurricular activity where you're using the university resources, like their buildings and their time, and I run it's called a performance collective, for example.
That's just called research.
I'm not fucking going to ever call it research.
But you will in a document to the university, right?
No, I don't. No.
Oh, really?
No, I put it down as like stuff I do because I'm legally responsible for these people. I have a duty of care when we're doing performances outside of like, but it's not. It's their research. It's not mine. It's the students' research. It's these very minuscule threads that I would debate over that are really important things to debate over. Like, how can you facilitate something outside of the other economy, like what I was talking about before? Like, how do you support the possibility for a microeconomy that might be perceived as unethical or illegal or something, that actually is most of the time that which supports what we all do. It's officiated by the economy of the state and the institutions, but actually there is something else going on, and what is that and how is it spoken? And actually maybe we shouldn't speak about some of it. Like maybe that's a secret and maybe I'm not involved, or maybe you're not involved, or do you know what I mean? Like that these are kind of the things in order for there to be open fights and like not fights, but like conflict and debate and like what are we saving, what are we protecting, or what do we care about?
Yeah. Sorry. Part of Seb's question says talks about professionalism as a means for survival, as like a practical means for survival. And as soon as I read that, my mind was like, no, I don't agree. Like you can't survive by just being a professional. But then I thought about the word survival and I was like, I guess you can. Sometimes it just feels like surviving by doing the professional part of things. But yeah, I wonder about like, you can't just be a professional because art is so personal and like just through this, so personal and so meaningful. So there's like a lot more to it. And it's those parts for me anyway that make me survive, or like beyond survive, but like enjoy.
And profess implies I know. Professionalize, like, do you know what I mean? I know, and I'm pretty sure that art runs on an economy of doubt as much as anything.
But I feel like maybe everything does, and I would question professional as a word. Like maybe the way that I understand it and the way I operate it within it might be different from like other people who work in the uni, or do you know what I mean?
Do you have anything to add, Indra? Or?
Well, that was really insightful for me. I'm just a fresh graduate, so it's really interesting to hear from like actual people who work in uni and all that. I'm sitting next to the Lisa Radford. Come on.
And she smells.
Just take in that fan moment, Lisa.
But yeah, I don't know. Like I think Leen just mentioned about the professionalism and like survival and all that, and how like first years are like, oh, okay, you teach me how to write a grant and like proposal writing and all that. My experience in uni was quite like that whole individual work kind of thing, and there's not really like collaborative works and all that. It's kind of like, it's not encouraged, but it's kind of like your own stuff, like if it's at your own interest. And there was about only 2 collaborations in my batch, and in a batch of 20 people, I think. But yeah, I don't know, I guess it also kind of makes me think, and this is really weird for me to say next to like people who work in art academia. It's like the connection from the connections of ARIs and universities, to me, it kind of feels like a race to become like, who is the most esoteric academic artist ever to emerge from the top 3 art universities in art schools in like Melbourne. And yeah, like even writing my own exegesis felt funny and weird. It was just kind of like writing really, really high into like big vocabulary paper, trying to justify what I want to do and what I'm trying to do, which is great. I think I love writing and all that. But I took honors because I felt pressured to by like the industry, not by like actually I was like, oh, you must be taken, but kind of felt that kind of feeling from fellow students and art students and also people who are kind of like more established. And like mind you, my first solo show was in Blindside, and that proposal I applied in 2021 before I went to art school. And that when I told people that, I felt rather kind of like looked down in the sense that, oh, how did you get in? You didn't go to art school, kind of like reactions. And I thought that was quite interesting. But yeah, I don't know, it felt improbable for me to like, let's say like reach where I'm like here right now in like West Space, Unison and all that without art academia experience and all that. But I don't know.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, the word academia is such an interesting like overlay. I think. I mean, I work with like it's a big art school. Like there's a lot of artists and students there, and all of those artists have really different experiences. Some have PhDs, some do not. They all have different material practices. They all have different reading or philosophical practices or how they draw on their work. So it's like the word academic feels like a really big blanket that's inappropriate if you want to make an art school in some ways. I think about, because I teach the honours this year, like the writing thing, and I think about this a lot because I mean I'm lucky. I write. I like it. It's hard, but I like it. But then what does that mean for an artist who doesn't like writing, and then they should be able to have the possibility to fulfil this criteria of being an honours graduate if that's what they want. So what does that mean? What format can it look like? Why do we have to perform the same demands as art history? Because we shouldn't have to. And how is that articulated, and who's defending that or something? Do you know what I mean? These are, I mean, they're ongoing questions, no answer. I think it's an ongoing debate.
I think that actually raises an interesting question about maybe what artists can do or could possibly do for academia. I think, like, because we've talked about trends within ARIs and art communities, but also trends within universities towards understanding things like a practice-led approach to research that's more focused on the artwork than the writing. And from what I've observed, because I studied at UNSW, but now I work at University of Sydney. So what I've observed at them and other unis is this shift towards seeing, it's so slight though at this moment, but seeing the importance of like qualifiers rather than quantifiers, like working on like they want to do socially engaged projects. They're more interested in collaborating, like they want their research projects to be done in collaboration with communities outside of university. Like there's that's kind of happening, and I think that potentially, like if there are artists kind of doing these much more higher academic degrees and kind of showing the evidence that practice is has a lot of integrity as a form of research and a form of like storytelling, even or like explaining how the world works. Or
Has just many forms.
Yeah,
like has many forms.
Yeah, I think there's potential for institutions to maybe like actually really learn something from the art schools that they've bought at some point and not really thought about much. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'm thinking about like Indra, when you applied to Blindside without doing an arts degree, like what compelled you? And I guess we're moving into question 3 now, but that idea of the artist journey. So you've like graduated from university. Yeah. To the panel, like what kinds of lives and careers can artists working in metropolitan centres look forward to? And do these reflect the issues that we've been speaking about? So I guess in the context of, the homogenizing forces of gentrification and the slow institutionalization of artist-run initiatives, like where is the room for experimentation or risk-taking? Does anyone want to open that up?
I can keep talking. I think it's a really interesting question. When you said, what can artists look forward to? I was like, I look forward to living like a happy and healthy life with meaningful friendships. Like that's what I look forward to first. And yeah, that's kind of beyond art, but I think also maybe the key to healthy communities as well for artists. I hope. I hear a lot of artists kind of say that they want more opportunities to experiment. So I think that we should be or could be a shift towards experimentation, not just for specific artists, but for like how we work together as well. Like I know there's a shift towards kind of project-based ARIs rather than trying to sustain a gallery space to host exhibitions, for example. So that's a bit more of a flexible experimental model. And
would you say Sydenham International's like that, or?
It could be because they do host kind of projects that are a bit more flexible and not necessarily about an exhibition.
Yeah, it's a artist-run initiative you probably know about it, but they, like, you know, an artist can go to them and say, hey, I just want to try this out, and they'll go around to facilitate that.
And
which is, sorry.
Oh, and Consuelo's a lecturer at university as well, right?
Yeah. And that's really nice that there's a space to do that. I think there should be more room for experimentation. I just hear artists say, oh, I want to do this thing, but it's not finished yet. And I'm not sure if it's the same here as in Sydney, but in Sydney, people only present things when they're like done, really, or something is
the stakes are a lot higher.
Yeah.
The rent is much more expensive. Like
Yeah.
living
It
is
is
much
harder
more.
to be
It's
an
hard.
artist in
Like
Sydney.
that's why I wonder if there's like more. The models have changed differently. Because I remember in 2000 when lots of the artist-run spaces closed in Sydney because of the Olympics, because that's when the rents went up.
I should say my comment sounded blanket about it being hard to be an artist in Sydney. I mean, I meant from that financial point of view. Just there's also less artist-run spaces popping up. Even I think geography has something to do with it as well. Like the spaces are further apart, and getting around that city can be quite difficult.
Yeah, and because of that slight scarcity, there's people are less maybe willing to experiment and be vulnerable in that way because they don't know how they'll be received within a context where a lot of things are very polished and often financially supported by larger institutions.
Or commercial.
But yeah, my hope is that artists can look forward to having more opportunities to experiment and be vulnerable and maybe loosen up a bit about kind of stressing on perfectionism or I can't think of the word, just less seriousness maybe, a bit more kind of gentleness,
I guess a follow-up question open up to everyone on the couch is like, what is the role of artist-run initiatives in facilitating that kind of pathway for artists to work in that way?
Do you feel like that maybe they're all quite different in that way that they connect to artists and artist practices? Like, I guess we start our premise here on Westspace and how that it's professionalised to what it is now, and I just think there's a lot of like when I went to Sydney, I was like, oh, we're not all just getting on a tram, going to a bunch of openings and eating cheese and having wine for dinner. But like on the same night, you know, there's like Sydenham International is trying to open up this gap, and Brendan is not as academic as Consuelo, so I think they try to balance that out, and also make it a space for artists who don't have or haven't had the same kind of like like opportunities, or artists that are trying to are in a vulnerable position. They just want to try something, and facilitating the kind of discussions around that from the community, because I think that's maybe the thing that also draws us to ARIs is the community that we start, and the connection to art school. Is that the communities that you start in art school are the ones quite often a lot of those people are the same people in your life throughout your practice
Poor John Campbell.
who you need to who you help each other when you're in a bind in making something. Say, the people who've known you for a while will be like, get your hand off it. Like, the reason why you're having trouble right now is because this isn't a part of your processes and you just want to try, that kind of. So a lot of that too, I think, is those relationship building. And when you're a student, you don't have those relationships and you start to build them in art school, but you're also being guided by your lecturers who become your friends and colleagues and just, just all those people who you met who sat next to you in class. Like when I moved to Sydney, my ex-partner of what would become 10 years sat behind me. James Newen sat next to them. Consuelo sat next to me. It was such a really great introduction to a new city. And I feel like we don't get through this whole journey. Even I'm looking at Tarika, gave me my first institutional job, awesome coordinator and teacher, just letting people know out there. That's how you keep going in a way. Just finding those people. We met through friends and artists in Sydney,
I don't know how we're going for time. We're going over time. Okay.
You've got 1 minute.
Are there any final remarks?
So I just would like to back Salote up because I think that's the economy I'm talking. Like there is a different economy, and I think it's actually all right for now to think about what is the next model because maybe the research point gallery is not a great model. When you're saying you're going to take the research points for already that thing. Like what is the next thing that needs to happen?
I guess
what do artists and as an old person now, like what is my role? No, because it becomes like a term of like responsibility. So like because sometimes you don't want to talk, you don't want to hear the sound of your own voice or something, but like what is it that should be, what pathway should be opened? Things can only run for 1 year, 1 week. Like what are those things? What are the support things that we need or should be created? I don't know.
The comment about research was really just a backhander about how when you're stuck in an institutional situation, you're like, how do I make this work for what my practice is doing and who I work with and what I want to happen. And I do think that quite often we would not be using the word research if art schools hadn't become a part of universities.
I think speaking as a fresh graduate, so like I feel like the ARIs in Melbourne, now Melbourne is very like it needs to be perfect at this point of like stage from exhibition, and that kind of like puts a high pressure because I feel like I know AR is supposed to be like a space you can experiment and all that, but it kind of like you can experiment, but it's gonna be perfect at the same time a lot of the time.
But it does. Okay, I got to question that too because you're right. Like you are trying to make the perfect, like where you think is at that most perfect point. But I do think a practice is a journey, and maybe the work that you make in your first ARI, you wouldn't think of making like, or you might. You don't have the same freshness. I tell you what, later on. But
I hate the first work I made for Blindside. I don't like it.
But I do think that's something to also build into your practice about what the experience, experience for you and for your audience is in like what is perfection. Something we never really attain, except for if you've got one of these mics and you wash your hair last night.
Well, we may as well end on that. Could everyone here join me in thanking Lisa, Indra, Leen and Salote for their time? And I'll hand back over to Joe.